There was a time when the continents existed in a state that feels almost impossible to imagine today. It was not simply empty land, but something quieter, something unfinished, as if the surface of the planet had been laid out but never fully awakened. There were no forests rising toward the sky, no roots threading through soil, no soft layers of life shaping the ground. In fact, there was no true soil at all, only exposed rock slowly breaking apart under forces that had no intention of creating life. Wind moved across these continents without resistance, sweeping over empty plains and jagged surfaces, with nothing to slow its path. Rain fell from heavy skies, but it did not nourish anything. Instead, it carried minerals away, dissolving pieces of the land and returning them to the oceans, as if the continents themselves were slowly being erased. Rivers cut through the surface, but they followed no living guidance, no roots to hold their banks, no vegetation to soften their flow. They carved deeply and unpredictably, shifting with the terrain in ways that felt restless, almost searching, yet never finding anything that could anchor them. The air above this world carried a different weight, thicker with gases that would one day be transformed, quieter without the subtle exchanges of life that now fill every moment. There were no leaves releasing oxygen, no invisible networks balancing the atmosphere, no quiet breathing of forests rising and falling with the light. Even time itself seemed to move differently here, stretched across vast spans where change came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the planet was waiting for something it did not yet understand. It is difficult to imagine a world so completely without memory, where nothing grows, nothing decays, and nothing leaves a lasting trace. Today, every piece of land carries layers of history shaped by countless generations of living things, but in this distant past, the continents held no such record. They existed in silence, defined only by physical forces, untouched by the slow, patient work of life. And yet, beneath this stillness, there was a sense of something missing, something not yet present but somehow necessary. The earth was not truly empty. Life already filled the oceans, moving, adapting, and evolving in ways that would eventually reach beyond the water. But here, on land, that story had not yet begun. The continents waited, not in stillness, but in preparation, shaped slowly into something that could one day hold life in a completely new way. And the only place where that change could begin was not deep within the land, but at its edges where the boundary between water and rock was never fully stable. Along these shifting margins, something subtle was already happening, something so small it would leave no mark at first, yet powerful enough to reshape everything that followed. Thin films of life would one day begin to cling to these surfaces, testing the limits of existence beyond water, though at this moment, that future remained invisible. For now, the land remained unchanged, a vast and quiet expanse that did not yet know what it could become. It did not know that it would one day support forests, or that those forests would change the air, the climate, and the course of life itself. It did not know that beneath its surface, roots would break stone, or that above it, canopies would stretch toward the light. All of that belonged to a future that had not yet been imagined, a transformation that would begin so quietly that nothing at this moment could possibly reveal it. This was a world before memory, before connection, before the land understood how to hold life. And in that silence, something waited, not as a plan or a purpose, but as a possibility, something that would emerge slowly at the edge of two worlds where change could finally begin. That edge would become the first doorway between what existed and what was about to exist. At the edge of the continents, where water met stone in a restless shifting boundary, something began to change. This was not a clear frontier, not a place where one world ended and another began, but a narrow, uncertain zone where conditions were never stable for long. The tides moved in quiet rhythms, covering the land and then pulling away, leaving behind surfaces that were wet for a moment and dry the next. It was here, in this fragile space, that life first reached outward. For a long time it did not stay. Thin layers of microbial life spread across damp rock when the water receded, forming delicate films that shimmered briefly under the light. Early algae clung to these surfaces, taking advantage of the brief presence of moisture, only to be exposed again as the tide withdrew. The land was not welcoming. The air pulled moisture away too quickly. The sunlight, unfiltered and direct, carried an intensity that few organisms could withstand for long. What seemed like opportunity quickly became risk. Again and again, life extended itself into this boundary, and again it retreated, not in failure, but in response. Each movement outward was cautious, almost tentative, as if the living world itself was uncertain of what it might find beyond the safety of water. There was no sudden arrival, no decisive moment when life claimed the land. Instead, there was hesitation, repetition, and quiet persistence. What made this moment remarkable was not success, but continuity. Even when these early organisms did not survive for long, they left something behind. A thin layer of organic material settled onto the rock. Tiny particles became trapped within these films. Moisture lingered just slightly longer than before. The surface began to change in ways that were almost impossible to see. Over time, these traces accumulated. What had once been bare stone began to hold subtle variations, small pockets where conditions were less harsh, where life could remain for just a little longer. Each attempt, no matter how brief, altered the environment in a way that made the next attempt slightly more possible. The land itself was beginning to respond. Though it had no awareness of what it was becoming, this was not conquest. There were no dominant forms, no rapid expansion, no clear direction. It was something slower, more uncertain. Life was learning, not through intention, but through repeated interaction with a world that resisted it at every step. The boundary between water and land became a place of quiet experimentation, where progress could only be measured over immense stretches of time. The difference between this moment and what came before was subtle but profound. Life was no longer entirely confined to the oceans. It had begun to touch the land, even if only briefly, even if only in fragile, temporary ways. And yet those brief moments mattered more than they seemed, because with each cycle of advance and retreat, something was being built. Not a structure, not a visible system, but a set of conditions that did not exist before. The land was beginning to hold on to life, even if only in traces. It was beginning to change from something completely resistant into something slightly more possible. From a distance, nothing would have appeared different. The continents still looked barren. The surfaces still dominated by rock. But beneath that appearance, a quiet process was unfolding, one that would continue long after any individual organism had disappeared. And as these fragile attempts continued, the balance slowly shifted. The boundary itself began to change, becoming less hostile in small, uneven patches. These changes were not dramatic, not sudden, but they were cumulative, building upon one another in ways that could not easily be reversed. What began as hesitation was becoming something else, something that could not yet be fully seen but could no longer be undone. The change did not arrive with movement or sound. There was no moment when the land suddenly came alive, no visible shift that could be marked or remembered. Instead, it began so quietly that it could have been overlooked entirely, a transformation unfolding beneath the surface of a world that still appeared unchanged. Across damp stretches of ground, where water lingered just long enough to soften the rock, small forms of plant life began to appear. They did not rise high or spread far in any dramatic way. They stayed close to the surface, simple in structure, almost fragile in appearance. To any distant observer, the land would still seem empty, still defined by stone and silence. And yet, something had begun. These early plants did not simply exist on the land. They interacted with it in ways that had never happened before. Their primitive structures extended into the rock, not as deep roots like those that would come later, but as delicate threads that pressed into tiny fractures and surfaces. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to break it apart. Minerals that had once remained locked within solid stone were released, mixed with the remains of these early organisms as they lived and died. Thin layers of organic material began to gather, combining with broken rock to form something entirely new. For the first time, the surface of the earth was no longer just rock. It was becoming soil. This process did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, unevenly, in scattered patches where conditions allowed it to continue. But once it began, it did not stop. Each small layer created the possibility for the next. The ground, once resistant, began to hold moisture longer to support more life, to change in ways that could not be easily reversed. At the same time, another transformation was taking place, one that could not be seen at all. These early plants were interacting with the atmosphere itself. They drew in carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen in return, altering the balance of gases in a process so slow that no single moment could reveal its importance. The air began to shift, though nothing within that world could sense it yet. The climate responded in subtle ways, patterns of temperature and moisture adjusting over long stretches of time. The changes were so gradual that they left no clear boundary between what had been and what was becoming. What made this moment extraordinary was not how it appeared, but how it accumulated. Each small plant, each thin layer of soil, each quiet exchange of gases contributed to something far larger than itself. The land was no longer simply receiving life in brief, uncertain attempts. It was beginning to support it, to sustain it, to participate in it. And yet, this transformation remained invisible. There were no towering structures, no forests to announce what was happening. The world still looked much the same as it had before, but beneath that familiar surface, the rules were changing. The realization, when it comes, feels almost unexpected. These small, unassuming plants were not just adapting to the conditions of the earth. They were altering those conditions, reshaping the land, the air, and the future of life itself. What had once been an environment that resisted life was becoming one that could nurture it. There was no clear moment when the balance shifted, no instant when the change became undeniable. But as time continued, the process gained momentum. The patches of living ground expanded. The soil deepened. The atmosphere continued its slow transformation. The land was no longer empty. It was no longer waiting. It had begun to change in a way that could not be undone, a process that would continue building upon itself, growing more complex, more visible, and more powerful with each passing age. And from this quiet foundation, something new would eventually rise, something that would no longer remain close to the ground, but reach upward, changing not just the surface of the earth, but the space above it as well. For a long time, life remained close to the ground, spreading quietly across the surface in low, simple forms that followed the contours of the land. It adapted to what was available, shaping the soil, adjusting the air, but never rising far above the surface that sustained it. The world, though no longer empty, still felt flat, as if everything existed within a single layer, close to the boundary where rock had first begun to soften into something more. Then, slowly, something changed. It did not begin as a sudden transformation. There was no clear moment when life decided to reach upward. Instead, small variations began to appear among certain plants, subtle differences in structure that allowed them to grow slightly taller than those around them. These changes were not dramatic at first, barely noticeable against the wide stretches of low vegetation, but they carried an advantage that would soon reshape everything. Within these early plants, simple internal systems began to form, allowing water to move upward from the ground through their structures. This quiet development removed a limitation that had held life close to the surface for millions of years. No longer entirely dependent on immediate moisture at ground level, some plants could extend higher, reaching further into the air. At first, the difference was small, a slight elevation, a gentle rise above neighbouring forms. But even this was enough to change the balance. Sunlight, once evenly distributed across the surface, became something that could be reached for, competed over, and gradually claimed. For the first time, height mattered. As these plants extended upward, the land began to change in ways that had never occurred before. What had once been a uniform surface now developed layers. Some areas received more light, others less. Small variations in temperature and moisture began to appear, creating conditions that differed from one place to another, even within short distances. And then, something entirely new emerged. Shadows where these taller plants stood, light was no longer constant. The ground beneath them shifted into partial darkness, protected from direct exposure. These shaded areas held moisture longer, cooled more slowly, and created pockets of stability that had never existed on land before. The environment was no longer consistent. It was becoming complex. Yet these early structures were not what we would recognize as forests. They did not form dense canopies or continuous coverage. They stood apart from one another, unevenly spaced, rising in isolated clusters that gave the land a strange and unfamiliar appearance. The world was changing, but it had not yet become what it would one day be. There was something almost incomplete about it. These first upward-reaching plants did not dominate the landscape. They introduced a new dimension, but they did so gradually, without overwhelming what already existed. The land now held variation, contrast, and the beginnings of vertical structure, but it remained open, exposed in many places, still in transition. What made this moment significant was not how it looked, but what it allowed. By rising above the ground, these plants altered the rules of survival. They introduced competition where none had existed before, created environments within environments, and opened possibilities that could not have emerged in a flat world. The land was no longer a single surface. It was becoming layered, dynamic, and increasingly interconnected. And as these structures continued to spread, their influence extended beyond what could be seen. Beneath the surface, unseen systems were developing alongside them, shaping the ground in ways that would prove even more powerful than what rose above it. What rose above the ground was only part of the story. Beneath those early structures, hidden from sight, something far more powerful was taking shape. As plants grew taller, their connection to the land deepened, extending downward in ways that transformed not only their survival, but the surface of the earth itself. These early root systems were not yet as complex as those of modern trees, but they were enough to anchor life firmly into the ground. Instead of resting lightly on the surface, plants began to hold the land, pressing into it, spreading through it, reaching into cracks and spaces that had once remained untouched. What had begun as a simple extension for stability quickly became something more. Roots did not merely sit within the soil, they changed it. As they pushed into rock, they widened small fractures, slowly breaking apart surfaces that had resisted change for millions of years. Water followed these pathways, moving deeper into the ground, carrying minerals, dissolving structures, and accelerating a process that would have otherwise taken far longer. The land began to soften, not all at once, but gradually, as if yielding to a pressure it could no longer resist. Over time, this quiet interaction reshaped entire landscapes. The thin, uneven layers of early soil deepened, enriched by the constant cycle of growth and decay. Organic material accumulated more efficiently, mixing with broken rock to create a foundation capable of supporting increasingly complex life. What had once been unstable began to settle into something more permanent. The changes extended beyond the immediate ground. Rivers, which had once carved through loose and shifting terrain, began to behave differently. With roots holding the soil in place, their paths became more defined, their flow more predictable. Sediments that would have been carried away were now trapped, stabilizing the land and allowing ecosystems to develop with greater continuity. The surface of the earth was no longer chaotic in the same way. It was becoming structured. Yet even these visible changes were only part of a larger transformation. Beneath the ground, within the growing layers of soil, something else was unfolding, something that reached far beyond the landscapes themselves. As plants continued to grow, they drew carbon from the atmosphere, incorporating it into their structures. When they died, that carbon did not simply return to the air. It became part of the soil, buried within layers that grew thicker over time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, carbon was being removed from the atmosphere and stored within the earth. This process did not produce immediate results. There was no sudden shift in the sky, no visible signal that the balance of the atmosphere was changing. But over immense stretches of time, the effects began to accumulate. The composition of the air shifted. Climate patterns responded. The planet itself began to adjust to a new equilibrium. All of this emerged from something that could not be seen. The realization is quiet but profound. Forests are often understood by what rises above the ground. The trunks, the branches, the leaves reaching toward the light. But the true force of their transformation lies below, in the hidden systems that anchor them and reshape the world from within. They are not passive elements of the landscape. They do not simply grow within the environment they are given. They alter it steadily and continuously, guiding the evolution of the land, the movement of water, and even the composition of the atmosphere itself. And as these underground systems expanded, their influence began to extend outward, reaching beyond the soil and into the broader systems of the planet, shaping not just the land, but the future of life in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. There was no single moment when the change could be seen, no sudden event that marked the turning point. And yet over time the direction of the planet began to shift in ways that would never be reversed. What had once been scattered patches of growth, small and uncertain, were now spreading outward, connecting across landscapes, expanding into something far greater than their beginnings. The land was no longer isolated in fragments. It was becoming a system. As forests extended across continents, their influence moved beyond the ground beneath them. The soil they created continued to deepen, holding moisture and nutrients in ways that supported even more growth. The atmosphere, already changing through the slow work of plant life, continued its quiet transformation. Carbon dioxide levels declined, drawn steadily into living structures and buried within the earth. Oxygen released in return, accumulated in the air, altering the balance that had existed for so long. None of these changes could be seen in a single glance. They unfolded across immense stretches of time, blending into one another so gradually that no clear boundary separated what had been from what was becoming. And yet, taken together, they formed something undeniable. The planet itself was adjusting. Weather patterns began to shift in response. In some regions, rainfall became more stable, sustained by the presence of forests that held moisture and released it back into the atmosphere. The land, once exposed and unpredictable, developed cycles that supported continuity rather than disruption. Environments that had once been fragile grew more resilient, capable of sustaining life across longer periods. But this transformation was not entirely gentle. As conditions changed, so did the pressures placed on every form of life. Organisms that had adapted to earlier environments found themselves in landscapes that no longer behaved the same way. Some could adjust, evolving alongside the shifting conditions. Others could not, disappearing quietly as the world moved beyond them. The forests did not simply create opportunity. They introduced competition. With more stable environments came greater density of life. Space, light, and resources were no longer equally available. They became something to be reached for, secured, and defended. The land, once defined by simplicity, was becoming increasingly complex, filled with interactions that shaped survival in ways that had never existed before. This complexity brought both stability and tension. Systems formed, cycles strengthened, but within them, constant change continued. No part of the environment remained untouched by the influence of the forests. The ground, the air, the water, and the living world all became connected within a process that could no longer be separated into individual parts. The realization emerges slowly, almost unexpectedly. Forests did not simply grow on the earth. They changed what the earth was. What had once been a world of bare rock and scattered life had become something entirely different. A planet where land itself could sustain complex systems, where the atmosphere supported new possibilities, where life was no longer confined or limited in the same way. The direction had shifted. There was no return to what had existed before. The conditions that once defined the continents had been replaced, not through force but through accumulation. Each small change had built upon the last until the outcome became inevitable. The quiet world of exposed land was gone. In its place was something more dynamic, more interconnected, and more demanding, a world where life did not simply exist, but shaped and responded to the environment in continuous cycles. The threshold had been crossed without noise, without warning, and without a clear beginning or end. And from this point forward, everything that followed would emerge from the conditions these forests had created. A new chapter unfolding from a change that no single moment could ever fully contain. At first, the change could be felt more than seen. The land, once exposed to an unbroken stretch of light, began to soften in ways that were difficult to explain. Sunlight still reached the surface, but not in the same way. It no longer fell evenly across every space. Instead, it was interrupted, filtered, broken into shifting patterns that moved slowly with the passage of time. For the first time, the earth knew shade. These early forests did not form dense, continuous canopies like those of the modern world. They stood in scattered clusters, uneven and unfamiliar, their structures still simple compared to what would come later. And yet even this was enough. As their forms reached upward, they created areas where light no longer dominated completely. Beneath them, the ground changed. Where sunlight was softened, temperatures dropped slightly, moisture, once quickly lost to the air, lingered longer. The soil, already forming through earlier transformations, began to hold water in ways it never had before. The land, once harsh and exposed, developed pockets of calm, small regions where conditions remained stable for longer periods. These shaded areas did not appear all at once. They formed gradually, unevenly, scattered across the landscape. But each one created something new, an environment within an environment, a space where different rules began to apply. Life responded immediately, though not in obvious ways. Within these cooler, damp surfaces, microorganisms began to thrive more consistently. They no longer depended entirely on brief moments of moisture. The ground itself now held enough stability to support ongoing processes. Organic material accumulated more efficiently, and with it came new forms of interaction. Fungi, quiet and unseen, began to spread through the soil, forming delicate networks that connected patches of life beneath the surface. They moved through the damp ground, breaking down material, redistributing nutrients, shaping the environment in ways that could not be observed directly. Decomposition, once limited and slow, became part of a continuous cycle. The land was no longer just a place where life existed. It was becoming a system where life interacted, recycled, and sustained itself over time. What had once been isolated events began to connect into ongoing processes, and yet none of this required large changes in appearance. From a distance, the world might still seem similar, still defined by open spaces and scattered growth. But within those spaces, something entirely new had emerged. The presence of shade introduced variation, and with variation came complexity. The realization unfolds quietly. Forests did not simply grow across the land. They created new conditions within it. Beneath their structures, environments formed that had never existed before, each one supporting different forms of life, each one contributing to a system that extended beyond any single organism. The earth was no longer a surface exposed to a single set of conditions. It had become layered light and shadow, moisture and dryness, exposure and protection, all began to coexist, shaping the behavior of life in ways that could not have been possible in a uniform world. The landscape developed depth, not just in its physical form, but in the processes that moved through it. There was also something else, something more subtle. A sense of enclosure began to take hold. Not complete, not overwhelming, but present. In these shaded areas, the openness of the land gave way to spaces that felt more contained, more sheltered, more defined by their surroundings. The world was no longer entirely exposed, and within these newly formed environments, something unexpected began to emerge. Life that was not fixed in place, not anchored to the ground, began to move through these spaces, exploring conditions that had only just become possible. At first, the movement was so slight it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Beneath the early forests, within the shaded spaces where moisture lingered and the ground softened, life had already begun to settle into new patterns. The soil held more than minerals, and plant remains now. It held possibility, and within that quiet, protected layer something unfamiliar began to appear. Small creatures, barely noticeable against the dark surface, moved for the first time across land that could now sustain them. They did not arrive in great numbers, nor did they spread quickly. Their presence was cautious, almost hesitant, as if each step tested a world that was still becoming. These early animals, simple in form and limited in ability, explored the forest floor with no clear path, only responding to the conditions around them. Arthropods, primitive insects, and other small invertebrates emerged within this environment, finding in it something that had never existed before. Shelter, the canopy above, though sparse and uneven, softened the harshness of the surface. Sunlight no longer dominated every moment. The air near the ground remained cooler, more stable. Moisture did not disappear as quickly, and the soil held enough consistency to support life that depended on it. For the first time, the land offered protection. Food, too, became more available. As plants grew and died, their remains accumulated, forming layers of organic material that could be consumed and broken down. What had once been a simple surface was now a place of resources, a system where energy could be transferred and reused. These early creatures did not dominate this world. They were not yet adapted for control or expansion. They moved slowly, carefully, responding to a landscape that was still shaping itself around them. Their existence was fragile, dependent on conditions that could still shift in subtle ways. And yet their presence changed everything. Movement entered the system. Until this point, life on land had been largely fixed in place, rooted, growing, responding slowly to changes in the environment. But now, something could move across the surface, interact with different areas, carry energy from one place to another. The forest floor was no longer still. As these creatures moved, they influenced the soil beneath them. They broke apart material, mixed layers, accelerated the process of decomposition. Nutrients that might have remained in one place began to circulate more freely, supporting new growth in ways that had not been possible before. The system became more dynamic. Interactions began to form, not just between organisms and their environment, but between living things themselves. Some fed on plant matter, others on smaller organisms, creating the earliest forms of relationships that would grow more complex over time. The land was no longer a collection of isolated processes. It was becoming connected through movement, through interaction, through the presence of life that could respond in real time to its surroundings. The realization unfolds slowly. Forests did not simply provide a place for life to exist. They created the conditions that allowed entirely new forms of life to emerge on land. Without shelter, without moisture, without the stability of soil, these creatures could not have survived. The forest did not just support life, it invited in benefit. What had once been a silent surface, shaped only by physical forces and slow biological change, was now beginning to respond, to shift, to evolve through interaction. The presence of these small creatures marked the beginning of something deeper. The land had begun to move, and as movement spread across the forest floor, new relationships began to form, subtle at first but powerful in their accumulation, shaping a balance that would continue to evolve with every passing moment. At first, the connections were almost impossible to see. The forest floor, already alive with small movements and quiet growth, began to develop something deeper than presence. What had once been a collection of individual organisms, each existing within its own limited role, slowly became something more integrated. The boundaries between them began to blur, not in form, but in function. Life was no longer acting alone. Plants continued to grow, drawing energy from light and shaping the air and soil around them. Beneath them, fungi extended their networks further, threading through the ground in ways that linked distant patches of life together. The small animals that had begun to move across the surface interacted with both, feeding, breaking down, and redistributing what they encountered. At first, these interactions were simple. A creature consumed decaying plant matter. Another fed on softer tissues. Fungi broke down what remained, returning nutrients to the soil. But as these processes repeated, they began to form patterns. Energy started to move through the system. What had once remained in one place now passed through many. The remains of a plant became nourishment for smaller organisms. Those organisms, in turn, supported others. The soil absorbed and redistributed what was left, allowing new growth to emerge. Each part of the system began to depend on the others, not by design, but through the accumulation of countless small interactions. The forest was becoming a network. Within this network, new behaviors began to appear. Some organisms adapted to feed directly on living plant material, not just what had already decayed. Others began to consume smaller creatures, introducing the earliest forms of predatory interaction. These behaviors were still simple, still limited, but they added another layer of complexity to a system that was already changing. The balance of the environment began to shift. Growth was no longer the only process shaping the land. Consumption, competition, and response became part of the cycle. Life did not simply expand, it interacted, adjusted, and adapted in relation to everything around it. And yet this balance was not fixed, it moved constantly, adjusting to changes in conditions, responding to variations in moisture, light, and availability of resources. In some areas growth would dominate. In others, consumption would limit expansion. The system never settled into a permanent state. It remained dynamic, shifting in ways that were both subtle and continuous. The realization comes quietly, but once it forms, it changes everything. Forests did not simply provide space for life to grow. They created relationships. They established dependencies between organisms that could not exist in isolation. They introduced competition, forcing life to adapt not only to the environment, but to each other. The land had become connected. For the first time, survival was no longer determined by individual conditions alone. It depended on a network of interactions, a web of life that extended across the forest floor, linking organisms together in ways that could not easily be separated. This complexity brought a new kind of stability. The system could support more life, maintain itself through cycles of growth and decay, and adapt to changes more effectively than before. But it also introduced something else. Vulnerability, because in a connected system, changes in one part could affect many others. A shift in one population, a change in one condition, could ripple through the network, altering balances that had taken time to form. The strength of the system lay in its connections, but those same connections made it sensitive to disruption. The forest was no longer a simple environment. It had become a living system, dynamic, interconnected, and constantly evolving. And as these networks continued to grow, expanding across the land and deepening in complexity, their influence began to reach beyond the forest floor, shaping not just local environments, but the entire planet in ways that were only just beginning to emerge. The change was no longer confined to the ground. For a long time, the transformation of the earth had been something that unfolded beneath the feet, within the soil, across the slow expansion of forests and the quiet spread of life. But as these systems grew and connected, their influence began to extend upward, reaching into the sky itself in ways that could not be seen, yet could not be stopped. The air was beginning to change. Each plant, no matter how small, participated in a process that seemed almost simple. It drew in carbon dioxide and released oxygen. On its own, the effect was too slight to notice, too limited to alter anything in a meaningful way. But there was no single plant. There were countless forms of life, spreading across continents, repeating this exchange again and again over spans of time that stretched beyond imagination. The accumulation became inevitable. Carbon dioxide, once abundant in the atmosphere, began to decline, drawn steadily into living structures and stored within the earth. Oxygen released as a byproduct slowly increased, filling the air with a substance that had once existed in far smaller amounts. The balance shifted, not abruptly but continuously, as if the atmosphere itself was being rewritten line by line. No single moment revealed the change. There was no visible boundary between the air that had existed before and the air that was forming now. The transformation unfolded across millions of years, blending into the background of time so completely that it could not be observed directly. And yet, when viewed across that immense scale, the effect was unmistakable. The sky was no longer the same. As oxygen levels rose, the nature of the atmosphere changed. It became more reactive, more capable of supporting processes that had previously been limited. The air held new potential, not only for the plants that shaped it, but for other forms of life that would eventually depend on it. The difference was not in how the air appeared, but in what it allowed. With more oxygen available, the possibilities for life expanded. Energy could be used more efficiently. Movement could become more sustained. Structures could grow larger, supported by an environment that could now meet greater demands. The limitations that once constrained life began to loosen, opening pathways that had never existed before. And yet, this transformation remained silent. No sound marked the shift. No visible signal announced what was happening above the forests. The same sky stretched across the planet, unchanged in appearance, even as its composition moved steadily towards something new. The realization comes quietly, almost unexpectedly. The air that exists today, the air that supports every breath, is not something that has always been this way. It is the result of this long, continuous process, shaped by the slow and persistent work of forests that once covered the earth in forms very different from those that exist now. What feels natural was created. The forests did not stop at the surface of the land. They extended their influence upward into the atmosphere, altering it in ways that would define the future of life. They shaped not only where life could exist, but how it could exist, setting the conditions for everything that would follow. The scale of this change is difficult to fully grasp. What began as small, quiet systems of growth and interaction had expanded into something planetary, something that reached beyond any single environment. The land, the air, and the living world were no longer separate. They had become parts of a single connected process. And as the atmosphere continued to shift, new possibilities began to emerge, subtle at first, but filled with consequences that would soon become impossible to ignore. As the air changed, so did the possibilities within it. For millions of years, life had adapted to the limits of the environment, growing only as large as its systems could support, moving only as far as energy and structure would allow. Those limits had been quiet but constant, shaping every form that emerged on land. And then, without any visible signal, those limits began to shift. The increase in oxygen did not announce itself, yet its effects began to appear in ways that could not be ignored. Among the most striking were the creatures that moved through the air and across the forest floor. Arthropods, already present in earlier forms, began to grow larger than anything that had existed before. Their bodies, structured in ways that relied on passive diffusion of oxygen, responded directly to the richness of the atmosphere around them. Where oxygen was more abundant, their limitations weakened. Insects that would once have remained small now expanded in size. Wings stretched wider, bodies grew longer, and movements that had once been limited became more powerful and sustained. The air itself seemed to support them, allowing them to exist in forms that would not be possible in a different environment. The world began to fill with shapes that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Dragonfly-like creatures moved through the air with wingspans far greater than those seen today, gliding above the forests in slow, deliberate motion. Other arthropods navigated the forest floor, their forms enlarged, their presence more noticeable, yet still part of a system that had only recently begun to take shape. There was something mesmerizing about it. These creatures did not dominate in the way large animals would later do, but they carried a presence that changed how the environment felt. Their size alone altered the perception of the world, introducing a scale that had not existed before. And yet there was also something unsettling. The familiar patterns of life were stretched beyond what would now seem natural. Forms that resembled modern insects appeared larger, more pronounced, their movements both graceful and slightly unfamiliar. The balance between what felt known and what felt strange created a sense that this world, though real, did not fully belong to the one that would come later. The reason for this shift was not found within the creatures themselves, but within the air they depended on. Oxygen, once limited, now filled the atmosphere in greater concentrations, allowing biological systems to operate differently. Energy could be used more efficiently. Structures that once could not be sustained became possible. The boundaries that defined size and capability were no longer the same. The realization unfolds with quiet clarity. Forests did not simply create environments where life could grow. They altered the conditions that determined how life could exist. By changing the composition of the atmosphere, they reshaped the physical limits that had once governed every organism. What seemed like a natural boundary was, in fact, flexible. And as those boundaries expanded, life responded, exploring possibilities that had once been out of reach. Size, movement, and structure all shifted, creating a world that felt both expanded and unfamiliar. But this expansion carried its own consequences. As organisms grew larger and systems became more complex, the balance that supported them also became more delicate. Greater size required greater stability, more resources, and more precise conditions. What the environment allowed, it also had to sustain. The world was no longer defined by simplicity. It was becoming a place of increasing scale and complexity, where changes in one part of the system could have wider effects than before. The air had opened new possibilities, but it had also introduced new dependencies. And as life continued to grow, both in size and in complexity, the balance that held it together began to tighten, setting the stage for changes that would not remain quiet forever. The world had become richer, more alive, more complex than it had ever been before. Forests stretched across the land, the air carried new energy, and life moved through systems that had taken millions of years to form. From a distance, it might have seemed like a moment of perfect balance, a time when everything had finally settled into place. But beneath that appearance, something quieter was beginning to shift. The same processes that had allowed life to expand were also introducing new conditions, ones that were not always stable. As oxygen levels rose, the atmosphere became more reactive, more capable of sustaining not only life, but other forces that had once been limited. Fire, once rare and difficult to sustain, began to behave differently. In forests where plant material had accumulated over long periods, dry conditions could create environments where flames, once started, could spread with unexpected intensity. The presence of oxygen allowed combustion to continue more easily, turning what might have been small, contained events into something larger, something capable of moving across the land. These fires were not constant, nor were they universal. They appeared in certain places, under certain conditions, shaped by patterns that were still forming. But their presence introduced a new element into the balance, one that could alter landscapes in ways that growth alone could not. At the same time, the climate itself continued to evolve. The removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, combined with other shifting factors, began to influence global temperatures. In some regions, cooling trends emerged, subtle at first, but gradually affecting the distribution of life. Rainfall patterns shifted, becoming more stable in certain areas while less predictable in others. The balance between moisture and dryness, growth and limitation, adjusted in ways that were not always consistent. The planet was not becoming unstable in a sudden or dramatic way. Instead, it was entering a phase where multiple systems interacted more closely, where changes in one area could influence many others. This complexity brought both strength and tension. Forests, which had created the conditions for life to flourish, now also contributed to environments where disruption could occur. Dense vegetation, combined with varying climate patterns, created situations where stability depended on a delicate balance between opposing forces. The realization emerges slowly. The systems that supported life were not purely protective. They carried within them the potential for change, for disruption, for events that could reshape the very environments they had helped create. Growth and vulnerability existed together. The forests were not simply safe havens. They were dynamic systems, capable of sustaining life, but also capable of altering it in ways that could not always be controlled. The same conditions that allowed life to expand also introduced pressures that required constant adjustment. This did not mean the world was in decline. It remained full, active, and evolving. Life continued to grow, to adapt, to respond to the conditions around it. But the sense of perfect balance began to fade, replaced by something more complex. A balance that required constant change to maintain. The land, the air, and the living systems within them were no longer moving in simple patterns. They were interacting in ways that created both opportunity and risk, shaping a world that could not remain the same indefinitely. And as these subtle shifts continued, something deeper began to form, a transformation that would not only affect the balance of the forests, but begin to reshape them from within, guiding the next stage of the Earth's long and unfolding story. There was a time when the land was no longer defined by open space. Forests spread across the continents in vast uninterrupted stretches, forming some of the largest living systems the Earth had ever known. What had once been scattered growth had expanded into something continuous, something that reshaped the appearance of the planet itself. From horizon to horizon, the land was covered in green. The air within these forests carried a different quality. It was heavier with moisture, filled with the quiet exchange of gases, rich with oxygen in ways that supported life at a scale not seen before. Movement through these environments would have felt slower, softened by the density of growth and the thickness of the atmosphere. Towering plant forms rose upward, their structures more developed, more defined than the early pioneers that first reached above the ground. Beneath them, layers of vegetation filled the spaces between, creating a complex arrangement of life that extended from the forest floor to the highest points of growth. The ground itself was rarely exposed. Thick undergrowth covered the soil, fed by continuous cycles of growth and decay. Fallen material accumulated, broken down over time by the systems that had developed beneath the surface. Moisture remained within the environment, held by the dense presence of plant life and the stability of the soil that had formed over millions of years. These forests did not exist in isolated regions. They stretched across vast areas, connecting landscapes in ways that made the planet feel unified under a single living system. The boundaries between environments were less distinct. Variation existed, but it was part of a continuous whole rather than separate, isolated spaces. Life within these forests was abundant. Small creatures moved through the undergrowth, larger forms began to appear in response to the changing conditions, and interactions between organisms became increasingly complex. The systems that had formed earlier continued to develop, supporting a level of activity that filled the environment with constant, though often subtle, movement. And yet, this world would not feel entirely familiar. Though it shared characteristics with modern forests, it operated under different conditions, shaped by an atmosphere and a balance of life that no longer exists in the same way. The scale, the density, and the composition of these environments created something that was both recognizable and strangely distant. The realization unfolds gradually. This was not simply a period of growth. It was a peak. The forests had expanded to a point where they dominated the planet in a way that would not be repeated. The balance of conditions that allowed such vast systems to exist together across such large areas was specific to this moment in Earth's history. What seemed like a natural state was, in fact, temporary. The world had reached a stage where forests defined the land itself, shaping not only the surface but the atmosphere, the climate, and the possibilities for life. It was a moment of fullness where expansion had reached its highest extent. And yet, beneath this abundance, something less visible was beginning to form. The very systems that supported this vast growth were carrying subtle imbalances, conditions that had not yet revealed themselves fully. The forests appeared stable, continuous, and self-sustaining, but within them, processes were unfolding that would slowly begin to change that balance. What looked endless was not without limits. And as these hidden changes continued to develop, they would begin to shape the future of these forests in ways that could not yet be seen, introducing shifts that would move the world beyond this moment of quiet dominance. The forests continued to grow, spreading across the land with a quiet persistence that seemed almost limitless. Layers of vegetation rose, lived, and eventually fell, returning to the ground in a cycle that had, until now, maintained a sense of balance. But as these systems expanded and deepened, something began to change in the rhythm of that cycle. What fell to the forest floor no longer disappeared in the same way. In earlier stages, organic material had been broken down steadily, returned to the soil, and reused within the system. But the plants that now dominated the land had developed structures that were stronger, more complex, and more resistant to decay. Their tissues, built to support height and stability, did not easily yield to the processes that had once recycled them. When these plants died, their remains began to accumulate. Trunks, branches, and layers of dense material settled onto the forest floor, forming thick deposits that did not fully break down. The organisms that existed within these ecosystems could process some of this material, but not all of it. Something within the composition of these plants resisted complete decomposition. The system had encountered a limitation. Over time, the accumulation became more noticeable. Layer upon layer of organic matter built up, compressing under its own weight, altering the structure of the ground itself. In some areas, the forest floor rose higher, shaped not by new growth, but by the remains of what had come before. This was not decay in the usual sense. It was preservation. The balance between growth and breakdown had shifted. What the forests produced could not be fully returned to the cycle. The system continued to expand, but it carried with it an increasing weight of material that could not easily be processed. And within that accumulation, something else was happening. The carbon that had been drawn from the atmosphere by living plants was no longer being released back into the air at the same rate. Instead, it remained locked within these layers, buried deeper over time as new material settled above it. The ground became a storehouse of carbon, holding vast amounts that had once been part of the atmosphere. This process unfolded slowly, without any visible boundary marking its significance. The forests still appeared vibrant, full, and active. Life continued to grow, to interact, to expand. But beneath that activity, the imbalance was building. The realization comes quietly. For millions of years, the Earth had created something it could not fully take apart. The forests, in their growth, had produced materials that resisted the very systems meant to recycle them. What had once been a cycle was now interrupted, not completely, but enough to alter the long-term balance. This was not a failure. It was a stage. The accumulation of this material would not remain unchanged forever. Over immense periods of time, buried under layers of sediment and pressure, these deposits would transform into something entirely different. What had once been living forests would become dense, energy-rich formations hidden beneath the surface. What appears today as a resource, something extracted and used, began as a problem that nature had not yet solved. The forests had grown beyond the capacity of their own systems to fully sustain balance. Growth had outpaced decay, creating a condition where abundance carried its own consequence. And as this imbalance continued to deepen, the system moved closer to a point where change would become necessary, where the forces shaping the forests would begin to shift once again, guiding the next transformation of the planet. The change did not arrive as a collapse. There was no moment when the forests suddenly disappeared, no single event that marked their end. Instead, the shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, woven into the same slow processes that had allowed them to rise. The world remained full. The forests still stretched across the land, but something within their balance had begun to move in a different direction. At first, the signs were subtle. The climate, never truly fixed, continued to adjust. Patterns of temperature and moisture shifted across regions, altering the conditions that had once supported continuous growth. Some areas grew drier for longer periods. Others cooled in ways that changed how plant life responded. The stability that had allowed forests to expand so widely began to fragment, not suddenly, but gradually. At the same time, life itself continued to evolve. New organisms emerged within these ecosystems, shaped by the conditions created over millions of years. Among them were forms capable of breaking down plant material more efficiently than before. The structures that had once resisted decay began to yield, slowly at first, then with increasing effectiveness as these organisms spread. The balance between growth and decomposition began to shift again. Where layers of organic material had once accumulated, they now started to break down more completely, returning nutrients to the system in ways that had not been possible before. The ground changed, the cycles adjusted, and the long-standing imbalance began to ease. But this did not restore the forests to what they had been. Instead, it altered them. The dense, continuous systems that had defined this period began to transform into something less uniform. In some regions, forests thinned. In others, they adapted, shifting in composition and structure to match the changing conditions. The world remained green, but it was no longer the same. The sense of endless continuity began to fade. What had once stretched across vast areas without interruption now showed variation, gaps, and transitions. The forests were still present, still shaping the land, but they were no longer dominant in the same way. They were becoming part of a more complex and changing system. The realization unfolds with quiet clarity. Even the most expansive and powerful systems in Earth's history are not permanent. They exist within conditions that allow them to grow, but those conditions are never fixed. As they change, so too must the systems that depend on them. The forests that had once transformed the planet were now being transformed themselves. There is no sense of failure in this shift, no indication that something had gone wrong. It is part of the same process that had guided their rise. Growth, balance, imbalance, and change all move together, shaping the long history of life in ways that cannot be separated. The world does not hold onto a single state. It moves forward, continuously adjusting, reshaping itself through countless interactions between life and environment. What once seemed stable reveals itself to have always been part of a larger pattern, one that extends far beyond any single period of dominance. The forests, though still present, no longer defined the planet in the way they once had. Their influence remained, embedded in the soil, the atmosphere, and the systems that had developed because of them. But their form, their scale, and their role were beginning to shift. The end was not an ending in the way it might first appear. It was a transition. And as these ancient forests slowly changed, giving way to new forms and new balances, the story moved forward with them, carrying their influence into a future where life would continue to adapt, respond, and evolve within a world that never remains the same. The change did not arrive with a sound. There was no sudden collapse, no moment when the forests fell or vanished from the land. Instead, something quieter began to unfold, a shift so gradual that it could not be seen in a single lifetime. The forests remained, their forms still rising across the landscape, their presence still shaping the air and the soil. And yet they were no longer exactly what they had been. At first, the differences were almost impossible to notice. Rainfall patterns began to change in subtle ways. In some regions, moisture became less consistent, arriving later or leaving sooner than before. In others, cooling trends altered the balance of temperature, creating conditions that no longer matched what the forests had adapted to over millions of years. These changes did not happen everywhere at once. They appeared unevenly, scattered across the continents, forming patterns that were difficult to recognize until they had already taken hold. The forests responded slowly. In places where conditions remained stable, they continued much as they had before, dense and full, maintaining the systems that had defined them. But in other areas, the balance shifted just enough to weaken their continuity. Growth slowed. New plants struggled to take hold. Spaces that had once been filled began to open. The land began to fragment. What had once stretched without interruption now showed breaks, areas where the forest thinned or gave way to more open ground. These gaps did not appear as sudden clearings, but as gradual changes, where the density of life faded over time. The edges of forests became less defined, blending into spaces that no longer supported the same level of growth. There was no clear boundary between presence and absence. In some places, life persisted, adapting to the changing conditions, holding on to what had been established. In others, it receded, leaving behind ground that no longer carried the same vitality. The forest did not disappear. It shifted, becoming uneven, varied, no longer a continuous system. What made this moment powerful was its stillness. There was no single event to mark the change, no dramatic signal that something had ended. The processes that shape the forests continued, but they no longer produced the same results. Growth remained, but it was no longer balanced in the same way. The system, once expansive and dominant, began to adjust to conditions that were slowly moving beyond it. And because the change was so slow, it could not be fully seen. No single generation of life would have experienced the beginning and the end of this transformation. Each moment would have felt like a continuation of what came before, even as the larger pattern moved steadily in a different direction. The realization comes quietly. The most significant changes in the history of the Earth do not happen all at once. They unfold over time, so gradually that they exist beyond immediate perception. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with force. They emerge through accumulation, through countless small adjustments that together reshape the world. The forests did not fall, they simply stopped being what they once were, and within that subtle shift there is a quiet sense of loss, not the loss of something destroyed, but the fading of something that had once defined the planet. The continuity that had seemed endless was revealed to be temporary, shaped by conditions that could not remain unchanged. Yet, even as parts of the forests thinned and gave way to new spaces, life did not disappear. It adapted, moved, and responded to what was changing, finding new ways to exist within the shifting landscape. And within those changing conditions, new forms of life began to emerge, not suddenly, but gradually, taking advantage of the spaces left behind, preparing to shape the next stage of the world that was still unfolding. The fading of the old forests did not leave the land empty. Where density weakened and continuity broke, new forms of life began to appear, not as replacements in a sudden sense, but as responses to conditions that were no longer the same. The spaces left behind by thinning forests became opportunities. Though they did not resemble what had existed before, they felt unfamiliar, shaped by a world that was no longer stable in the way it once had been. The change in plant life was gradual but unmistakable. Among the shifting landscapes, new types of plants began to spread, carrying structures that allowed them to survive in ways the older forests could not. These plants did not rely as heavily on constant moisture. They developed systems that allowed them to retain water, to withstand periods of dryness, and to grow in environments where conditions varied more than before. The most significant of these changes lay in reproduction. Earlier plants had depended on water for the movement of their reproductive processes. limiting them to environments where moisture remained consistent. But now, new strategies began to emerge. Seeds, small and protected, allowed life to persist beyond immediate condition. They could endure, wait and grow when the environment became suitable again. This changed everything. The land no longer required constant stability to support plant life. Growth could occur in cycles, responding to changing conditions rather than depending on them to remain the same. This allowed vegetation to spread into areas that had once been too unpredictable, expanding the reach of life across a more varied landscape. The structure of the environment began to shift. Where dense forests once stood uninterrupted, new forms of vegetation appeared, sometimes less concentrated, sometimes more diverse. The land became a mosaic of different conditions, each supporting its own balance of life. Some areas retained elements of the old forests, while others transformed into environments that would not have been possible before. There was no clear boundary between what had ended and what had begun. The transition did not erase the past. It carried it forward, reshaped by new conditions and new possibilities. The systems that had once dominated the land did not vanish completely. They evolved, fragmented, and merged into something more varied, less uniform, and more adaptable. The world felt different. Not better, not worse, but changed in ways that altered how life interacted with the environment. The sense of endless continuity that had defined the great forests was replaced by variation, by cycles, by patterns that shifted over time rather than remaining constant. The realization emerges with quiet clarity. What appears to be an ending is also a beginning, though not in a way that feels immediate or obvious. The decline of one system creates the conditions for another to form, shaped not by what existed before, but by what the environment now allows. Evolution does not move toward perfection. It moves toward adaptation. And in this moment, adaptation favored flexibility, resilience, and the ability to exist within change itself. The new plant forms did not recreate the old forests. They built something different, something that could respond to a world that no longer held steady. The land, once dominated by a single form of growth, became more varied, more dynamic, and in many ways, less predictable. Life continued, not by restoring what had been lost, but by transforming into something that could survive what was coming. And as these new plants spread across the changing landscapes, the animals that depended on them could not remain the same. Their movements, their behaviors, and their relationships to the land began to shift as well, following the changes in ways that would shape the next stage of life's long and evolving story. The land no longer moved at the slow, steady pace it once had. Where early forests had created environments of quiet growth and gradual change, the new world felt more active, more responsive, and more demanding. The transformation of plant life did not happen in isolation. As the landscape shifted, everything that depended on it began to change as well. Animals that had once lived within stable, predictable systems now faced a world that required something different. Movement became more important. The spread of new plant forms created environments that were less uniform, more varied in both structure and resources. Food was no longer always found in the same places. Conditions could shift over time, requiring organisms to move, to search, and to adapt in ways that had not been necessary before. The forest floor, once relatively consistent, now held a mixture of spaces, some dense with vegetation, others more open, shaped by the changing patterns of growth. Life within these areas responded accordingly, becoming more mobile, more aware of its surroundings, more dependent on the ability to navigate a landscape that no longer remained the same. Competition increased. With variation came limitation. Resources were no longer evenly distributed. Access to food, shelter, and space became something that had to be secured rather than simply occupied. Organisms began to specialize, adapting to specific conditions, finding ways to survive within particular environments, rather than across all of them. This specialization created both opportunity and pressure. Some forms of life became more efficient in how they gathered energy, developing behaviors that allowed them to take advantage of specific resources. Others struggled, unable to adjust to the pace of change or the demands of a more complex system. Interactions became more defined. Predator-prey relationships, once simple and limited, began to take clearer form. Some organisms adapted to feed on others more directly, while others developed ways to avoid being consumed. These interactions added another layer of movement and response to the environment, shaping the balance of life in ways that were no longer subtle. The world felt different. It was no longer a place where life simply existed and expanded at a steady pace. It had become a system of constant adjustment, where survival depended on the ability to respond to change, to compete, and to adapt within shifting conditions. The sense of stillness that had once defined the forests faded. In its place came a quiet tension, not overwhelming, but present in every interaction. Life moved more frequently, responded more quickly, and adapted more continuously. The balance that had once felt stable was now dynamic, maintained through ongoing change rather than consistency. The realization comes gradually. The early forests had created a world where life could grow and establish itself, but the world that followed demanded something more. It required flexibility, awareness, and the ability to exist within a system that never remained the same for long. Stability had not disappeared, but it had changed form. It was no longer found in unchanging conditions, but in the ability of life to adjust to those that shifted. The balance of survival was no longer quiet or passive. It was active, shaped by movement, interaction, and continuous adaptation. The forest was no longer a place of quiet growth. It had become a place of constant survival. And as life adapted to this new balance, becoming more complex and more responsive, the changes extended beyond the organisms themselves. The planet continued to shift alongside them, its systems evolving in ways that would shape the next stage of this unfolding story. Beneath the surface of the Earth, beyond what can be seen or easily imagined, the forests have not entirely vanished. They remain, but not in the form they once held. As the ancient forests grew, lived, and eventually fell, their remains did not always return fully to the cycle of life. In many places, layers of plant material accumulated, buried gradually beneath sediments carried by water and shaped by shifting landscapes. Over time, these layers were pressed deeper into the earth, removed from the surface where decay would normally complete its work. The process was slow, unfolding across spans of time that no living system could observe directly. Pressure increased as more material settled above. Heat drawn from the depths of the earth began to alter the composition of what had once been living tissue. The structures that had once formed leaves, branches and trunks changed, compressed, and transformed into something entirely different. What had been forest became stone. These formations, now hidden beneath layers of rock and soil, are not lifeless in the way they first appear. They carry within them the memory of entire ecosystems, preserved not in detail, but in substance. Every layer represents growth, accumulation, and time, held together in a form that no longer resembles its origin, yet remains directly connected to it. The earth does not erase its past. It stores it beneath the ground. These transformed forests remain as quiet records of a world that once existed at the surface. They do not move, they do not grow, but they endure, unchanged by the passage of time that reshapes everything above them. From above, the land may appear separate from what lies beneath it. The forests that once dominated the planet have long since changed, replaced by new systems, new forms of life, new balances. But beneath that present world, the past remains intact in a different form, layered and preserved. The connection between these two worlds is easy to overlook. What appears as a resource, something extracted and used in the present, is not separate from the distant past. It is the result of processes that began long before any modern system existed. The material drawn from beneath the earth carries with it the history of growth, of accumulation, of transformation that unfolded over millions of years. The realization emerges slowly. When this material is used, when it is brought back to the surface and transformed into energy, something far older is being released. The carbon stored within it, once part of living forests, returns to the atmosphere. The energy it contains, captured long ago through the interaction between light and life, is set free once more. What seems like a simple act is connected to a history that stretches far beyond the present. The forests did not disappear without leaving anything behind. They changed form, becoming part of the earth itself, stored beneath the surface, in ways that would only be understood much later. The ground beneath our feet is not just solid and still. It holds the remains of worlds that once existed, preserved in silence, waiting to be uncovered. And as this connection between past and present becomes clearer, a deeper question begins to form, one that extends beyond the forests themselves, reaching into every part of the world that exists today. The air feels constant, as if it has always been this way. It surrounds everything, unseen yet essential, moving quietly through every living system without drawing attention to itself. It is easy to assume that it has always carried the same balance, the same composition, the same ability to support life as it does now. But the air is not a fixed presence. It is the result of a long and continuous history, shaped by processes that began long before the present world took form. The forests played a central role in that transformation. As they spread across the land, they did more than grow and interact with the soil. They reshaped the atmosphere itself, altering the balance of gases in ways that would define what life could become. Through the steady exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, carried out by countless plants over immense stretches of time, the air changed from something limited into something capable of sustaining far more complex forms of life. This transformation did not happen quickly. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, as each generation of plant life contributed to a process that no single organism could complete. The accumulation of oxygen, the reduction of carbon dioxide, and the shifting balance of the atmosphere all emerged from this quiet, persistent activity. The result was an environment that could support new possibilities. With more oxygen available, energy could be used more efficiently within living systems. Movement could become more sustained. Complexity could increase. The conditions that had once limited life began to open, allowing new forms to emerge, adapt, and evolve in ways that had not been possible before. What exists today is built upon that foundation. The air that fills the lungs, the oxygen that moves through every living cell, is not simply part of the present. It is connected directly to the past, shaped by the same processes that once transformed the planet under the influence of ancient forests. The connection is easy to overlook. Breathing feels immediate, automatic, separate from anything beyond the moment. But each breath carries with it a history that extends back hundreds of millions of years. The oxygen that supports life today is the result of countless cycles of growth, exchange, and transformation that began long before any modern system existed. The realization unfolds quietly. Life as it exists now is not just influenced by what came before. It depends on it. Without the changes created by those early forests, the atmosphere would not hold the same balance. The conditions required for complex organisms, for movement, for thought, for awareness, might never have developed in the same way. The present is not separate from the past. It flows directly from it, carried forward through systems that continue to operate even now. The forests that once shaped the air no longer exist in the same form, but their influence remains embedded within every process that depends on the atmosphere. There is something almost unnoticed in this connection. It exists in every moment, in every breath, in every movement that depends on oxygen. It does not require attention to continue. It does not reveal itself unless it is considered. And yet it is constant. The air that seems so ordinary carries within it the result of one of the most profound transformations in the history of the Earth. It is not simply part of the environment. It is a continuation of a process that began long ago, shaped by forests that once covered the land in forms now gone. If something as invisible as the air holds this kind of connection to the past, then its influence cannot end there. It must extend further, reaching into the structure of life itself, shaping not only how organisms exist, but how they are formed, how they interact, and how they continue to evolve within a world that carries the memory of everything that came before. What remains is not only beneath the ground or within the air, it exists in the way life organizes itself across the surface of the Earth, in patterns so familiar that they often go unnoticed. Forests, grasslands, wetlands, and even the systems shaped by human hands all follow structures that did not appear by chance. They emerged from processes that began long ago, when the first forests transformed the land in ways that continue to define it. The soil beneath every landscape carries this influence. What was once bare rock became layered, enriched and structured through the interaction of roots, microorganisms and time. That foundation has never disappeared. It supports every modern ecosystem, holding nutrients, retaining moisture and providing the conditions necessary for life to take hold. Without that transformation, the surface of the earth would not sustain the complexity it now carries. The cycles that move through these systems also trace back to that same origin. Nutrients do not remain in one place. They move, shifting through plants, soil, and organisms in continuous patterns of use and renewal. Growth leads to decay, decay returns to the ground, and from that ground new growth emerges. These cycles feel natural, as if they have always existed in this form, but they were shaped and refined during the rise of the earliest forests. The relationships between living things follow a similar pattern. Plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms do not exist in isolation. They depend on one another, forming networks of interaction that determine survival, balance, and change. These relationships were not always present on land. They developed as forests created environments, where connection became necessary, where life could no longer exist as separate, independent forms. Even the balance of the atmosphere remains part of this design. The exchange of gases between living systems and the air continues, maintaining conditions that support life across the planet. What began as a slow shift in composition has become an ongoing process, one that sustains every ecosystem, linking the present to the past through an unbroken chain of interaction. The realization emerges with quiet clarity. The world that appears natural, stable, and self-sustaining is not simply the result of random growth. It is the outcome of a specific turning point, a period when the structure of life on land was established in ways that have never been entirely replaced. The first forests did not just exist. They defined how life would continue. Their influence remains in every system that depends on soil, in every cycle that moves nutrients through the environment, in every interaction between organisms that shapes the balance of life. Even systems that seem distant from those ancient forests, including those shaped by human activity, rely on foundations that were created during that time. The design persists, even as the forms change. Modern ecosystems do not look exactly like those early forests, but they follow the same underlying principles. They organize themselves through similar patterns, respond to similar forces, and depend on structures that were established millions of years ago. There is something almost hidden in this continuity. The present feels immediate, separate from what came before, yet it is built directly upon it. Every landscape, every system, every interaction carries traces of that earlier world, shaped by processes that continue to operate without interruption. The forests that once dominated the planet are gone in their original form, but they have not truly disappeared. They remain in the structure of life itself, and as this connection becomes clearer, the story begins to shift, moving away from what has happened and toward what it means, inviting a deeper reflection on the world that exists now and the forces that continue to shape it. The world that exists today feels immediate, present, and complete. Forests rise across the land, oceans move with steady rhythm, and the air carries life in ways that seem constant and familiar. It is easy to see this world as something separate from what came before, as if it stands on its own, defined only by what exists now. But the surface of the earth holds more than what can be seen in a single moment. It carries memory, not in the way living beings remember, but in the structure of its landscapes, in the composition of its air, and in the systems that continue to shape life across the planet. The past has not disappeared. It has been absorbed, layered into everything that exists, forming a foundation that remains active even as time moves forward. Forests still stand, but they are not the same as those that once covered the continents in earlier ages. They have changed, adapted, and evolved through countless shifts in climate, environment, and life itself. Their forms are different, their structures more refined, their relationships more complex. And yet, beneath these differences, the influence of those ancient systems remains. The soil beneath modern forests carries the imprint of processes that began long ago. It holds the result of interactions between roots, microorganisms, and time, shaped by cycles that were first established when the land itself was learning how to support life. Even in places where forests no longer grow, the ground retains these changes, carrying within it the memory of what once existed above. The atmosphere tells a similar story. The balance of gases that supports life today is not a recent development. It is the continuation of transformations that unfolded over millions of years, shaped by the slow and persistent work of plant life. Each breath moves through a system that has been evolving for far longer than any single moment can reveal. Mountains, too, carry traces of this past. Their slopes, their erosion patterns, and the soils that gather upon them have all been influenced by the presence of life over time. What appears solid and unchanging has been shaped by processes that link it directly to the history of forests and the systems they created. The realization emerges quietly. The modern world is not separate from ancient history. It is a continuation of it. Every landscape, every system, every interaction is part of an ongoing process that began long before the present moment. What feels stable is not static. It is the result of continuous change shaped by forces that remain active even now. There is something almost hidden in this connection. The present appears complete, yet it is still unfolding. The past has not ended. It has been carried forward, influencing what exists now and what will come next. The forests that once transformed the planet have left their mark in ways that cannot be removed, only built upon. The world is not new. It is a memory still in motion, shaped by everything that has come before, and continuing to change in ways that cannot be fully predicted. The boundaries between past and present begin to fade, revealing a single continuous story rather than separate moments in time. And as this connection becomes clearer, a deeper question begins to form, one that reaches beyond what has already happened and into what is still to come, asking what role these living systems will play in shaping the future of the planet itself. The world feels steady. Seasons follow one another in familiar patterns. Forests grow and renew themselves, and the air continues to support life with quiet reliability. There is a sense of balance in these systems, a feeling that everything is held in place by forces that do not need to be questioned. But this stability, though real, is not something that has always existed in its current form. It is something that was created. The balance that shapes the modern world emerged from processes that began long ago, when forests first altered the land, the atmosphere, and the relationships between living systems. Climate patterns, oxygen levels, and the diversity of life all developed through these changes, forming conditions that allowed ecosystems to grow and sustain themselves over time. What exists now is built upon that foundation. The air continues to cycle through plants and animals, maintaining a balance that supports movement, growth, and interaction. The soil holds nutrients, shaped by countless generations of life that have contributed to its formation. Ecosystems organize themselves into networks, where each part depends on the others to maintain stability. These systems feel natural, as if they have always been this way, but they are not permanent. The same processes that created this balance are still active, still shaping the world in ways that are often too gradual to notice. Just as ancient forests once rose, expanded, and eventually transformed, the systems that exist today are also part of a continuous cycle of change. There is no fixed point where balance remains unchanged. It adjusts, responding to shifts in climate, variations in life, and interactions that unfold over time. Stability exists, but it is maintained through movement, through the ability of systems to adapt rather than remain constant. The realization unfolds slowly. The world that feels stable is not guaranteed to remain the same. It is the result of long and complex processes that have created conditions capable of supporting life as it exists now, but those conditions are not fixed. They depend on interactions that continue to evolve. This does not suggest instability in a sudden or dramatic sense. It suggests continuity. The balance that supports life today is part of an ongoing story, shaped by the same forces that influenced the earliest forests. It exists because certain conditions have been met, because systems have formed in ways that allow them to sustain themselves. But as those conditions shift, the balance will adjust with them. There is something quiet in this understanding. It does not call for urgency or alarm. Instead, it invites awareness, a recognition that the world is not static, even when it appears to be. The patterns that feel permanent are part of a larger process, one that extends beyond any single moment. The forests that once reshaped the planet did not disappear suddenly. They changed, adapted, and gave way to new forms that continued the process. In the same way, the ecosystems that exist today are part of a continuum, shaped by what came before and influencing what will come next. The balance we experience is not an end point. It is a phase. And within that phase, the same forces that have always shaped the Earth continue to operate, guiding the evolution of life and the environment in ways that may not always be visible, but are always present. As this understanding settles, the story begins to shift once more, moving beyond what forests have already done and toward what they may still become, as part of a process that has never truly stopped. The story never truly paused. From a distance, it can feel as though the great transformation of the Earth belongs entirely to the past, as if the rise of forests, the shaping of the land, and the change of the atmosphere are events that have already happened and settled into history. But the closer the world is observed, the more difficult it becomes to separate what has been from what still is. The same processes continue. What began as small, uncertain steps at the edge of land and water has carried forward into every system that exists today. The growth of plants, the movement of nutrients, the exchange of gases, and the relationships between living things all follow patterns that were established long ago, yet remain active in every moment. The forests that once reshaped the planet are no longer present in their original form, but their influence has not ended. It has expanded. Modern forests grow differently, adapt differently, and exist within a world that has already been shaped by countless changes. And yet they continue to perform the same quiet work, drawing from the air, shaping the soil, supporting life, and influencing the balance of the planet in ways that are not always visible. The connection is continuous. There is no clear boundary where the past stops and the present begins. The systems that formed millions of years ago have not been replaced. They have been carried forward, adjusted, and integrated into the world that exists now. The realization emerges gently. The story of forests is not something that ended. It is something that became. It became the landscapes that stretch across the continents, the air that supports life, the systems that connect every organism to its environment. It became the structure of the world itself, a foundation that continues to evolve rather than remain fixed. And within that ongoing process, there is a place for everything that exists now. The present is not separate from the past. It is part of the same unfolding sequence, shaped by the same forces that once turned barren land into living systems. The changes that defined those early moments did not disappear. They continue to operate, guiding the development of life in ways that are often too gradual to notice. There is something quiet in this continuity. It does not require attention to continue. It does not depend on recognition to exist. It moves forward steadily, shaping the world in ways that feel natural, even though they are the result of a long and complex history. The sense of distance between then and now begins to fade. What once seemed ancient and separate becomes connected, part of a single story that has not reached its conclusion. The forests that once changed the planet are still changing it, though their forms and environments have evolved. The world is not finished. It is still forming, still adjusting, still responding to the same underlying processes that have always guided it. The future is not something entirely new. It is an extension of what has already begun, and within that understanding, something shifts. The story is no longer something to observe from a distance. It becomes something that surrounds, something that includes everything that exists within it. The air, the land, the living systems, and even the quiet processes that move beneath the surface all belong to this ongoing narrative. The story continues. not as something separate from the present, but as the present itself, unfolding slowly, carrying forward the memory of everything that has come before, and shaping what has yet to emerge in a world that never stops becoming. The story does not move in a straight line. It does not begin at one point and end at another, leaving everything else behind. Instead, it follows a rhythm, one that unfolds slowly, repeating in ways that are not always obvious, but always present. The rise of the first forests, their expansion across the land, their transformation, and their gradual decline were not isolated events. They were part of something larger, a pattern. Across the history of the Earth, systems emerge, grow, and stabilize. They reach a point where they seem complete, where everything appears balanced and sustained, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, they begin to change. Conditions shift, life adapts, new forms emerge while others fade. The balance that once defined the system gives way to something new. This process does not happen only once. It repeats, not in identical ways, not with the same outcomes, but with a structure that remains familiar. Growth leads to expansion. Expansion leads to complexity. Complexity introduces vulnerability. And from that vulnerability, change begins again. The forests were one expression of this rhythm. They rose from a world that had never supported life on land, expanded into vast systems that reshaped the planet, and eventually transformed into something different as conditions evolved. What felt like a singular, extraordinary moment was, in reality, part of an ongoing sequence that has shaped the Earth again and again. The planet itself is not fixed. It moves not in sudden leaps, but through continuous adjustment. Climate shifts over time. Continents change position. Life responds to every alteration, adapting in ways that both shape and are shaped by the environment. The Earth is not a stage where events occur. It is an active system, constantly evolving through interaction. The realization unfolds gradually. Nothing in this history is permanent in the way it first appears. Stability exists, but only for a time. What seems complete is always part of a larger process that continues beyond it. The forests that once dominated the land felt enduring, but they were always part of a cycle that extended beyond their existence. And that cycle has not ended. It continues, moving through the present just as it did in the past, shaping the world in ways that are not always visible in a single moment. The same patterns of emergence, expansion, and transformation are still unfolding. Though they may appear different in form, there is something quiet in this understanding. It does not create urgency. It does not suggest instability in the immediate sense. Instead, it offers perspective. The changes that have shaped the Earth are not random or isolated. They follow rhythms that can be seen when viewed across long spans of time. What once felt unique becomes part of a pattern. The first forests were not an exception. They were a chapter within a much larger story, one that continues to move forward, shaped by the same forces that guided their rise and transformation. And as this perspective settles, the distance between past and present begins to narrow. The patterns that defined the ancient world are not gone. They are still active, still shaping the systems that exist today. The same processes that once turned barren land into living forests are continuing quietly within the world as it exists now. The cycle does not repeat exactly, but it continues, unfolding in ways that connect every moment to what came before. And as that connection becomes clearer, the story begins to shift once more, turning toward the present, where these patterns can still be seen, still unfolding, still shaping the world that exists today. The forests of today feel familiar. They rise across hills and valleys filled with sounds, movement, and life that seem natural and unchanging. Trees grow upward, leaves follow the light, and the ground beneath them holds layers of soil that support everything above. It is easy to see these environments as ordinary, as something that has always existed in this form, but they are not what they appear to be. The forests that exist now are not the same as those that first spread across the continents. Their forms have changed, their species have evolved, and their structures have adapted to conditions that have shifted over millions of years. And yet, beneath these differences, something remains constant. The same patterns continue. Trees still reach upward in competition for light, shaping the space around them as they grow. Beneath the surface, roots extend outward, interacting with the soil, forming networks that connect one organism to another. Nutrients move through the ground in cycles that sustain life, just as they did in the earliest forest system. The processes have not disappeared. They have been carried forward, adjusted and refined, but never replaced. The balance between growth and decay continues. The exchange between plants and the atmosphere still shapes the air. The interactions between organisms, visible and unseen, still define how life exists within these environments. What has changed is the context. Modern forests exist within a world that has already been shaped by countless transformations. The soil they grow from has been built over time, layered with the remains of earlier systems. The atmosphere they interact with has already been altered, carrying the results of processes that began long ago. Every part of their existence is influenced by what came before. They are not isolated systems. They are part of an inheritance. The land, the air, and the living networks within them carry the imprint of ancient forests, shaping how modern ecosystems function even as they take on new forms. What appears to be present and immediate is in reality connected to a history that continues to influence it. The realization emerges slowly. Every forest that exists today is both new and ancient at the same time. It grows in the present, responding to current conditions, adapting to the environment it occupies. But it also carries within it the continuation of processes that began hundreds of millions of years ago. The connection is not visible, but it is constant. Walking through a forest is not simply moving through a space filled with trees. It is moving through a system shaped by deep time, where every layer of soil, every exchange of air, and every interaction between organisms reflects patterns that have been repeated and refined across ages. There is something almost hidden in this familiarity. The present feels complete, yet it is part of something ongoing. The forests that exist now are not separate from those that came before. They are extensions of them, shaped by the same forces, guided by the same underlying processes. The world does not begin again with each generation of life. It continues. And as this understanding settles, the present becomes clearer, not as something isolated, but as part of a much larger sequence. The patterns that shaped the ancient world are still active, still influencing how life grows and interacts today. Which leads to a deeper question. If these patterns have continued for so long, shaping both the past and the present, then what form might they take in the future as the same processes move forward into conditions that have yet to fully reveal themselves? The future does not wait somewhere ahead. It does not begin at a clear moment, separate from everything that exists now. Instead, it is already unfolding, quietly forming within the same processes that have shaped the earth from the beginning. The forests, the atmosphere, the shifting patterns of life, all of it continues, moving forward without pause. What once transformed barren land into living systems has never stopped. The same forces remain active. Plants continue to grow, adapt, and respond to their environment. Climate continues to shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that are more difficult to notice within a single lifetime. Ecosystems adjust, reorganize, and evolve, guided by interactions that are always in motion. Nothing has become fixed. The forests that exist today are not permanent in their current form. They are part of a process that continues to shape them, just as it shaped the first forests long ago. Changes in temperature, moisture, and atmospheric composition influence how they grow, where they expand, and how they interact with the life around them. These changes are not separate from the past. They follow the same patterns. Adaptation remains constant. Life responds to conditions, adjusting in ways that allow it to continue. Some forms persist, others fade, and new ones emerge. Not suddenly, but gradually, shaped by the environment they inhabit. The world moves forward through this quiet exchange. The realization emerges with a sense of calm clarity. The future of forests is not something entirely new. It is part of the same continuous process that began when life first reached the land. The patterns that define their rise, their expansion, and their transformation are still active, guiding what will come next. The difference lies in perspective. It is easy to imagine the future as distant, as something that will happen later separated from the present by time. But in reality, it is already here, forming within the systems that exist now. Every interaction, every shift in condition, every adaptation contributes to what the world will become. The process does not pause. It does not wait for recognition or understanding. It continues, shaping the earth in ways that extend beyond immediate observation. The changes that define the future are often too gradual to notice, yet they are always present, unfolding with steady persistence. There is something quiet in this continuity. It does not carry urgency. It does not suggest that something must happen quickly or dramatically. Instead, it reflects the nature of the earth itself, a system that evolves over time, guided by forces that operate without interruption. The forests will continue to change. Their forms may shift, their distribution may adjust, and their interactions with the environment may evolve in response to conditions that are still developing. But they will remain part of the same story, shaped by the same processes that have always guided them. The future is not separate from this story. It is its continuation, and within that continuation there is a sense of quiet anticipation, not of something sudden or unknown, but of something that is already in motion, already forming, already becoming part of the long sequence that connects every moment of the Earth's history. The world is still unfolding. And as that understanding settles, the focus begins to shift once more, moving beyond time and change towards something deeper, the meaning carried within this continuous story, and what it reveals about the nature of life, the planet, and the connection between them. At the beginning, there was almost nothing to see. The land lay exposed, shaped by wind and water, untouched by the systems that would later define it. Life existed, but only at the edges, uncertain, fragile, and brief in its presence. Small forms appeared and disappeared, leaving little trace behind, as if the planet itself had not yet decided what it would become. It is easy to overlook those moments. They do not carry the weight of what came later. There are no towering structures, no vast ecosystems, no visible transformation that signals importance. Only small, tentative steps repeated over time, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. And yet, everything began there. Those early plants, simple and close to the ground, were not just surviving. They were changing the conditions around them in ways that could not be seen immediately. They interacted with the surface of the earth, altered the composition of the air, and began processes that would slowly reshape the planet. The change did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Each small action, each cycle of growth and decay contributed to something larger. What appeared as isolated events became part of a continuous pattern, one that extended far beyond any single moment. Over time, these patterns built upon one another, creating systems that would eventually transform the land completely. The forests did not appear suddenly. They emerged from these beginnings, shaped by countless small steps that no single generation could fully observe. The vast systems that later covered the earth were not the result of a single event, but the outcome of processes that unfolded gradually, almost invisibly. The realization comes with quiet clarity. What seems small is not without significance. What appears uncertain can become essential. The earliest moments of life on land did not carry the appearance of something powerful, yet they contained within them the potential for transformation. The greatest changes do not always announce themselves. They begin in ways that are easy to miss, unfolding slowly, building over time until their effects become impossible to ignore. The rise of the forests, the shaping of the atmosphere, and the transformation of the planet all trace back to beginnings that, at the time, would have seemed almost insignificant. There is something reflective in this understanding. The story does not move from greatness to greatness. It moves from small beginnings to large outcomes, shaped by persistence rather than sudden change. Each step matters even when it does not appear to. The land that once held no memory became a world filled with life, not through a single transformation, but through a sequence of quiet actions that built upon one another. And those actions continue. The processes that began in those early moments have not ended. They remain part of the world, guiding how life grows, adapts, and responds to the environment. The same patterns that shaped the past continue to influence the present, connecting every moment to those first uncertain steps. The beginning was never truly separate from what followed. It was part of the same unfolding story. And as that connection becomes clear, the story expands once more, moving beyond the events themselves and toward a deeper understanding of what they reveal about life, about change, and about the quiet forces that shape the world in ways that are often unseen. Nothing in the living world stands alone. At first, it can appear that life is made of separate parts, each existing within its own space, each following its own path. A tree grows from the ground, an animal moves across the land, the air passes through unseen, and the soil rests beneath it all. These elements seem distinct, as if they belong to different layers of the world. But this separation is only an illusion. Every part of life is connected, not in a simple or visible way, but through systems that extend across time and space, linking everything to something that came before. The forests, once seen as a chapter in Earth's history, are not separate from the present. They are part of a network that includes all living systems, continuing to shape how life exists even now. The air carries this connection. The oxygen that moves through every breath is not created in isolation. It is part of a cycle, one that began long ago when plant life first altered the atmosphere. Each exchange between plants and animals continues this process, maintaining a balance that depends on constant interaction. The soil holds another part of this network. What lies beneath the surface is not simply ground. It is the result of countless generations of life, broken down, transformed, and rebuilt over time. Nutrients move through it, supporting new growth, linking the past to the present in ways that are rarely seen but always present. Life depends on these connections. Plants draw from the soil and the air. Animals depend on plants and other organisms for survival. Microorganisms break down what no longer lives, returning it to the system so that it can be used again. Each part contributes to a cycle that does not begin or end with any single form of life. The realization unfolds slowly. The forests were never isolated events. They were part of a system that includes everything living on Earth. The processes they began continue, carried forward through every interaction, every exchange, every cycle that sustains life. There is no clear boundary between one part of the system and another. The air, the land, and the living organisms that move through them are all connected through processes that extend beyond immediate observation. What appears separate is, in reality, part of a continuous whole shaped by interactions that have been unfolding for millions of years. This connection is not something that can be easily seen. It exists beneath the surface, within the cycles that sustain life, within the patterns that repeat across time. It does not depend on recognition to exist. It continues, shaping the world in ways that feel natural, even though they are the result of a long and complex history. There is something almost meditative in this understanding. It shifts the perspective from individual parts to the system as a whole. Life is no longer viewed as separate pieces, but as a network of relationships, each part influencing and supporting the others. The forests, the atmosphere, the soil, and every living organism are part of this network. Nothing exists entirely on its own. The world is not made of isolated elements, but of connections that extend across time, linking the present to the past and carrying those connections forward into the future. And as this understanding settles, the story moves toward its final reflection, where all of these connections come together, revealing not just how the world has changed, but what those changes mean within the larger story of life itself. The story does not end. It cannot be placed within a beginning and a conclusion, because it continues beyond any moment that can be observed. From the earlier silence of barren land to the rise of forests that reshaped the planet, every stage has been part of something larger, something that does not stop when one chapter closes. The Earth has never been still. It has moved through time with quiet persistence, changing in ways that are often too slow to notice, yet powerful enough to transform everything. The forests that once spread across the continents are no longer what they were, but their influence remains, carried forward through the systems they helped create. New forests grow. They rise from soil shaped by ancient life, reaching into an atmosphere that still carries the imprint of past transformations. They are not the same as those that came before, yet they follow the same patterns, guided by the same processes that have always shaped the living world. The cycle continues. Growth, change, adaptation, and renewal unfold without interruption, forming a sequence that extends far beyond any single moment. What once seemed like an extraordinary transformation becomes part of a rhythm, one that repeats, evolves, and carries forward through time. There is no final state. What exists now will not remain unchanged. The systems that define the present will continue to shift, just as they have in the past. Forests will adapt, climates will adjust, and life will respond in ways that cannot be fully predicted, yet always follow the same underlying patterns. The realization comes gently. The story of the Earth is not something separate from the present. It is not something that can be observed from a distance, as if it belongs entirely to the past. It is ongoing, unfolding within every system that exists now. The air moves, the soil changes, life grows and interacts, all part of a continuous process that has never paused. There is something quiet in this understanding. It does not demand attention. It does not call for urgency. It simply exists, shaping the world in ways that are steady and consteady. The changes that define the Earth are not sudden interruptions. They are part of a flow that carries everything forward. The forests that once transformed the planet are gone in their original form, yet they are still present in what they created. Their influence remains in every ecosystem, in every cycle, in every connection that supports life. They have not disappeared. They have become part of the structure of the world itself, and that structure continues to change. New forms of life emerge, new patterns develop, and the balance of the planet shifts in response to conditions that are always evolving. The story does not repeat in the same way, but it continues, shaped by the same forces that have always guided it. There is no separation between observer and story. The realization settles slowly, almost unnoticed at first. The world that surrounds every moment is not something outside of experience. It is something that includes everything within it. The air that is breathed, the ground that is walked upon, the systems that sustain life are all part of this ongoing sequence. The story of the Earth is not something to watch. It is something already being lived. And as that understanding deepens, there is a sense of stillness, not as an ending, but as a moment, within something that continues without pause. The past, the present, and the future exist together within the same unfolding process. The story remains open, and it always will.